Tatskalawit oekaloma. Liloitza. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's good to see you here. Wenakisa Beth Piatot. My name is Beth Piatot. I am the director of the Arts Research Center. I'm also an associate professor of comparative literature and English. And I'm also Nez Perce. I'm a member of the Nez Perce tribe. And so my years as the director of the Arts Research Center has really focused on Indigenous arts. And tonight is an especially beautiful night for me because I get to introduce someone from my own tribe. Not only are we related because we are both Nez Perce and our families come from Lapwai, but because we both have jazz in our blood. My grandfather was one of the members of the Nez Percians, which was an early jazz band, and was a jazz man all his life. And so I personally, my older brother stole all the music genes, so I am an appreciator, a great appreciator of music and of jazz, and especially of the amazing, beautiful Julia Keefe. So it is such a joy to know that we can spend time with her this evening. And also, can I announce that she will also be coming back next year for cow performances with Julia Keefe's Indigenous Big Band. So as you are first to know, because I think it's not official, but I mean, it's official in terms of that it's happening, but it's not public. So, cone of silence. Just ignore the recording. Okay. So with that, I would like to begin with official biography of Julia Keefe. Then I'm going to step aside and allow her to give her presentation. I'll come up and start a conversation, ask a couple questions, but then we can open it up and have a broader conversation. It's such a nice, intimate group that we have here. Julia Keefe, Nez Perce, is an internationally acclaimed Native American jazz vocalist, actor, activist, and educator, currently based in New York City. Her professional career has spanned over 18 years, which is amazing because she's so young, over 18 years, and she has headlined marquee events at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., NMAI in New York, Kennedy Center, as well as opening for 20-time Grammy Award winner Tony Bennett, 4-time Grammy Award winner Esperanza Spalding. Julia's recent recording, Nobody Else But Me, was released to glowing reviews. Her life's work is the revival and honoring of the legendary Coeur d'Alene jazz musician Mildred Bailey, and is leading the campaign for Bailey's induction into the Jazz Hall of Fame at Lincoln Center. She currently directs the Julia Keefe Indigenous Big Band, highlighting the history and future of Indigenous people in jazz, which released their first studio recording in spring 2024. Julia Keefe grew up in Kamiah, Idaho, on our tribe's reservation before moving to Spokane, Washington, where she began studying music and competing at the Lionel Hampton Jazz Festival each year, where she won Outstanding Vocal Soloist in the alto division. She earned her BA in music from the University of Miami's Frost School of Music, taught jazz voice at Gonzaga University, and was a guest clinician at North Idaho College and Lionel Hampton Jazz Festival before relocating to New York City. She earned her master's in music from Manhattan School of Music in 2019 under the tutelage of Theo Bleckman, Kate McGarry, Joe Lowry, Stefan Harris, Dave Liebman, and Phil Markovitz. Julia also has a passion for Indigenous film and was a featured artist in Sterling Harjo's critically acclaimed documentary, Love and Fury. Her first feature film, Virginia, Minnesota, was the closing feature of the 2018 Catalina Film Festival. Julia Keefe is also the executive director of the board of One Heart Native Arts and Film Festival, an annual nonprofit festival in Spokane. showcasing the diversity and vitality of contemporary Native art in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. And it is such a joy for me to bring Julia Keefe here, someone whose heart and talents are so broad and based in our beautiful Nez Perce culture. So thank you, Julia. Katsiao. And
well, katsiao yao oikalo, tatsipine, inuinakisa himumukatse, inamunekdwas Julia Keefe. Good day, everyone. My name is Himumukatset. That's Nimiputimpt, Nez Perce language. It means she calls out from on high. I also go by Julia Keefe. I'm a member of the Nez Perce tribe. My name is actually, my Nez Perce name is actually a kind of interesting story. So we'll get into a little bit of the context of Indigenous people in the arts. We're going to talk about genocide. It's fine. But one of the things that the U.S. government did in order to ascertain or to acquire more lands that were originally allocated to Indigenous peoples was something called the Allotment Act. And in the Allotment Act, the U.S. government said, okay, so there are X amount of tribal members, and each of you are going to get an allotment of land. But there was more allotments of land than there were natives in the tribe, and thus the reservation got smaller. So for the first few months of my life, I was baby girl Keefe because my parents could not agree on a name at all, and so baby girl I was. But they went back into their family histories, and there was a Julia on both sides of my family. And Julia was the first owner of the allotment of land that is my family's land in Kamiah, Idaho. So then when it came time for me to get my Nez Perce name, I was 15, and my mom was doing some research and trying to find the right name for me. And she found those allotment papers for Julia, and her name written on, in English, this official government document, it said, Himoye Katset. Himoye Katset, what does that mean? So she went to, an elder in our tribe, and they're like, Himoye Katset, what does that mean? We don't even know. She walks up the mountain, and we're like, okay, yeah, that sounds nice. She walks up the mountain. I walk up mountains. That works. So I was named Himoye Katset at 15. But because of language revitalization efforts in Indian country, one of my cousins is the leaders of the Nez Perce language revitalization effort for our tribe, Leslie Moses, and she was looking at my name and she was like, this doesn't make sense. This is not, I don't know what this is. None of these words are Nimipu words. Like, this doesn't make sense. So she started doing research and looking at the big dictionary of, native words. And she was like, no, her name was Himumukatset. That's what Julia's name was, the original allotment owner and Julia Keefe. Himumukatset. And it means she calls out from on high. And at that point, I had already been a jazz vocalist for about 18 years. So for most of my life, I was she walks up the mountain. But lo and behold, it's she calls out from on high. So it all works out in the end. Thank you so much for coming out this evening to hear me ramble on. I tend to ramble. My brother says I sometimes don't know how to land the plane of my thoughts. So we're going to go on a journey together. And I hope you're excited about that. But I'm going to talk a little bit about Indigenous people in jazz, because that is my life's passion, is to celebrate the diversity and vitality and the indelible contributions of Indigenous people to this art form and the Indigenous people in the art form today. So we shall get going. All right, little introduction. Again, hello, my name is Julia. I'm the director of the Julia Keefe Indigenous Big Band. I got my bachelor's in music from the University of Miami Frost School of Music and Jazz Vocal Performance. and I received my master's from Manhattan School of Music and Jazz Vocal Performance as well. All right, a little bit of context. So, Indigenous people in the Americas have been here since time immemorial, and songs have been the vessels for stories and lessons and prayers since the creation of song. The first contact with the Americas was actually the Vikings when they established a settlement on the east coast of Canada. And in 1492, Christopher Columbus landed in the Bahamas on the island of San Salvador. So that's a little bit of context here. And now a little bit more. Western expansion, my favorite subject to talk about. So with the doctrine of discovery, was a legal concept from the Vatican that was basically like, go out into the world and conquer the lands and, take the lands for yourselves and destroy the cultures and force assimilation and, bring them to our Western way of thinking because we know best. Doctrine of discovery. That sort of set things in motion. Within the Declaration of Independence, so we have a funny thing going on right now in the world of the arts. The Kennedy Center recently changed a lot of their grant applications, taking away from highlighting underserved communities and minority groups, and they're pivoting their grant funding to celebrating the Declaration of Independence because we are coming up on 250 years of the US of A. So, the Declaration of Independence describes the indigenous peoples of the Americas as merciless Indian savages. Woo! Very exciting to submit that grant application called Merciless Indian Savages, 250 Years of America. But that was all sort of a way to create fear of the other, right? That really is what this is all about. We fear the other, that drives up our anger, that drives up our violence, and that drives up our entitlement to what that other has. So that was the whole purpose of that phrase within the Declaration of Independence, and was a way to get all of the colonists kind of like on board, like, oh yeah, those guys, they're not good, let's band together. The Marshall Trilogy were 3 landmark Supreme Court cases that enshrined the doctrine of discovery into U.S. law and asserted that legal powers of land ownership and sale of American Indian lands belonged to the U.S. government. So now, all Indian lands belonged to the U.S. government. The Monroe Doctrine was a legal policy that the U.S. was the sole colonizer of the Western Hemisphere. And manifest destiny, a phrase that has recently come back into the vernacular of US politics, which is kind of frightening, is the ideology that white American settlers were ordained by God to pursue US Western expansion. See, isn't this fun? Aren't you guys glad you came out? Yeah. So a little bit more context. Indian boarding schools. So part of what the U.S. government wanted to do with the original inhabitants of the land was to remove the children from their communities in order to kill the Indian in him to save the man. Essentially creating cultural disconnection and eventually breeding out the indigenous blood of these people. So the U.S. Department of Interior operated 408 boarding schools between 1819 and 1969. American Indian and Alaska Native children, as well as First Nations children, were forced to attend these schools that were either operated by the federal government, by the military, or by religious institutions, and they were forbidden from practicing their culture, their language, their spirituality, anything pertaining to their identity before coming to the schools. English was their first language, and they were taught to sing in choirs and play in marching bands, in church bands. It was part of that indoctrination was learning Western music. Now we get to the jazz. Yay! So what do we do with that knowledge, right? Music is something that is a healing practice. It is an experiential therapy. That's what psychologists call it. It's an experiential therapy that helps with combating trauma and is a protective factor against substance abuse and suicide in any community. So with this knowledge of Western music, with these Western instruments, for those who were fortunate enough to survive that brutal education, Indigenous students brought this music and these instruments back to their tribal lands and ended up creating their own big bands, their own marching bands, their own small jazz ensembles, their own church bands within their tribal communities. So it's also important to acknowledge that American Indian and Alaska Native communities were not completely separate from Western culture. So one of the super fun questions that we're often asked is, do you still live in teepees? Do you have the internet? Do you drive cars? Yes, to all of the above. Although we could get into another discussion about digital equity and access to internet, but that's like a whole other conversation for another time, so I'll save that for later. But it is important to acknowledge that American Indian and Alaska Native peoples did have this connection to the outside world, Western society. So, for example, in the 1920s, we had Wanda Savage, who was a member of Chickasaw Nation. She was a sharpshooter and a vaudeville performer. Maria Tallchief was a member of Osage Nation, and she was America's first prima ballerina. Now, has anyone here seen Killers of the Flower Moon or read Killers of the Flower Moon? Yeah? So Maria Tallchief is actually a result of that economic boom for Osage Nation. So the Osage were moved to a plot of land that was supposed to be not great, right? Lo and behold, there was oil underneath that land. And so the Osage people became incredibly, incredibly wealthy, with their children attending private schools, getting the finest, dance lessons, and being able to thrive within this Western society that was imposed upon them. The rest of that story is that eventually white men began marrying into the tribe, having children with Osage women, and then the Osage women were mysteriously dying. And that also created the FBI was investigating this reign of terror, is what it was called. But Maria Tallchief was able to become America's first prima ballerina because of that economic boom. Mildred Bailey, who has been my North Star for my entire musical career, was the first woman to sing in front of a big band in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And Russell Big Chief Moore, who was Pima, was a jazz trombonist beginning in 1935. He toured with Louis Armstrong. He played with the upper echelon of jazz musicians in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. All right, so we have these marching bands, right, and big bands forming on tribal lands all over the US and Canada. And if you don't believe me, let me show you. So this is actually a photograph of the Nez Perceans. Yeah, Beth. So, verified, check mark. And one of the guys in the big band with me, he's my bari saxophonist. His name is Orion White. He's a member of Nez Perce tribe as well. And his great grandfather was actually named Chief Titus. So he would perform with, as Chief Titus and the Nez Perceans, or Chief Titus and, his various ensembles. We also had an ensemble on Nez Perce Res called the Lollipop Six. So here are more photographs. Oftentimes they would be in regalia. One of the stories that I've heard is actually, so there's a guy out in Rosebud Sioux Res, and his name was Mike Hermany Horses. And his father used to go down to the musicians union, and just sort of say, hey, I'm available for hire. And when big bands would come through, on tour, they couldn't bring all of their saxophonists along because it's really expensive. So they would pick up some cats on the road. And so the story is that Mike's dad, got to sit in and play with Duke Ellington when they came through, the Dakotas on their way to Seattle, and played with Count Basie's band when they were on tour. So a lot of these native jazz cats were actually playing with these heavy jazz musicians because of the local musicians unions and being, have instrument will travel sort of freelance. So this is actually a promotion for Chief Titus and his 10 Royal Americans in Indian regalia. Beth asked a really awesome question before I got started, are there any recordings of these ensembles? And we're still in that sort of digging through all of these family heirlooms to try to see if there are recordings. So much of this has been kept as like family lore, and it's all very anecdotal, and a lot of folks have these, photographs and these things that were remnants of this, jazz career. But one of the fun things about the Indigenous Big Band today is that all of the members went back to their families and their tribal lands, and lo and behold, there were Indigenous big bands and jazz bands and all that stuff in their communities as well. So there is a pretty lush history, but we're still uncovering all of the really wonderful details. So let's move forward. So that's going all the way through the 50s and 60s, Indigenous jazz fusion. So has anyone here heard of Jim Pepper? Yeah. Jim Pepper was amazing. If you get the chance to listen to Pepper's Powwow, it is a phenomenal, phenomenal recording. Jim was an amazing saxophonist with a monster sound. And he was able to blend his indigenous melodies with rock and jazz in this sort of beautiful free fusion state. And what's so interesting about Pepper's Powwow, it begins with a peyote song. It's called Witchy Taito, and it is such a rock ballad anthem. I dance in my kitchen to Witchy Taito whenever I'm feeling the least bit poorly. But Pepper's Powwow came out in 1971. Indigenous peoples in the Americas were not allowed, they were legally forbidden from practicing their music, their spiritual practices, their culture until 1978. So there's this beautiful shift in the perception and practice of Indigenous people's music and culture in the 1970s. And one of the things that one of my first jazz history teachers taught me was, whenever you're looking at history of music, you want to look at what's happening politically, economically, socially, and spiritually, because it all influences the music, and the music also influences what's happening out that way. And so I think it's interesting that in 1971, Pepper's Powwow comes out. 1978, we're allowed to practice our traditional customs and spirituality. We also have the Indian Child Welfare Act that came out. So now Native children, when they go into the foster care system, they have to stay within their culture and not go out to non-Native families, which was a really huge part of the Indian Child Welfare Act, and retaining that cultural connection. So now let's jump into contemporary Indigenous jazz musicians. So now you see there is a historical precedent for Indigenous people in jazz. It's not some sort of weird, what does that mean and where do you come from? We have this long legacy and this lineage that we come from. So in the upper left-hand corner, that's Ed Littlefield. He's Tlingit, so originally from Alaska. He is currently in Seattle, and he has his own ensemble, the Native Jazz Quartet. They actually just did a tour in India as part of the State Department. They went out there. Down here on the lower left, that's Quinn Carson. He's Kiowa Apache, and he has an ensemble. He's based in Los Angeles now, but he grew up in Arkansas, and he was like, man, I was so excited to get out of Arkansas as a jazz musician. Oh my God. But he has a really wonderful ensemble, and he does reggae jazz fusion. Molly Obomsawin, has anyone here heard of Molly Obomsawin? Yeah. So Molly Obomsawin, she actually just scored Sugarcane, the documentary about Indian boarding schools that was nominated for an Oscar. She is Abenaki of Odanak, First Nation. She's based in Maine. Her album, Sweet Tooth, is fantastic. She is sort of like this free jazz chamber music, haunting awesomeness. You just definitely check out Molly Obomsawin's music. Upper right, we have Mark Carey, who is Mashpee Wampanoag. His mother is actually the chief of their clan, their tribe. And he's an amazing, amazing pianist. He performed with Abby Lincoln and Betty Carter, and he performs with Stephon Harris. He has his own Indigenous orchestra that he put together as well. It's a smaller ensemble. And then down lower right-hand corner is my great collaborator, Delbert Anderson, who is Diné. So Diné is actually the traditional name for Navajo tribe, so he's Diné. And his ensemble, it's like jazz hip-hop fusion. But he is fantastic. He went to his tribal leaders and asked if he could use the spinning songs, which are social songs from their culture, if he could use them in his music. And for a very long time, he was running up against a wall because so often tribal leaders were like, no, this is we have to protect our culture. We can't share this out. And that's an understandable feeling based off of all of the, a little bit of context slides. But because so many elders are, transitioning to the next world with this knowledge, and this knowledge is not being passed to the next generation, they eventually came back and said, Delbert, take these spinning songs and make them your own and pass them on to the next generation. Preserve what they are, but then also adapt them so that people keep singing these melodies and practicing this music. So he's been able to do that with his music as well. So that's the end of my slideshow. I got through it faster than I thought I would. But does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns, complaints? Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, I think we could probably, unless you want to look at my horrific, I'll just bring back we'll go back to the beginning. Indigenous people in jazz, we'll leave it there. So you don't have to look at my background. Anywho, so Mildred Bailey, again, she is the North Star for my career. I stumbled across Mildred Bailey's name when I was in high school. So I grew up on my tribe's reservation, and my only exposure to jazz prior to moving to Spokane was my mom had a Billie Holiday album of her greatest hits on the Decca label. And I remember as 4-year-old Julia just loving it, and which is weird for a 4-year-old to really, really love Billie Holiday. But oh my God, I was so into it. But then when we were living on our tribe's reservation, I didn't really see or experience jazz much. But I remembered this Billie Holiday melody just kind of lingering in my brain, in my subconscious. And then we moved up to Spokane, and jazz was very much at the central, it was the central focal point for music education in the Inland Northwest because of the Lionel Hampton Jazz Festival. And I immediately became the biggest jazz nerd on the planet. I couldn't get enough of it. And I stumbled across Mildred Bailey's name when I was reading up on Bing Crosby, because Bing Crosby went to my high school. And I thought, that's kind of awesome. I'm going to Bing Crosby's high school. He was kind of important. And while reading his autobiography, Call Me Lucky, he said, I'm very fortunate to have known Mildred Bailey early in my life. She had a heart as big as Yankee Stadium. And I thought, who's Mildred if she was influential in this man's career? And so that kind of got the snowball rolling. And so she was born in Tico, Washington in 1900. A lot of the bios that you will see for Mildred Bailey will say 1907 or 1904 or 1912, but her birth certificate says 1900. And she spent her early childhood on her tribe's reservation in De Smet, Idaho. Her mom was a really wonderful piano player. She learned from the nuns how to play the piano. And her mother, Josephine, married a guy named Rinker. They had kids, and they moved to Spokane. Her mother ended up dying of tuberculosis when Mildred was only about 17. And it was at that time that Mildred moved out of Spokane and moved to Seattle, and began singing the sheet music out in front of a music store. This is all, we're very much getting into the weeds of the Mildred Bailey story, but I hope that's okay. Mildred ended up marrying a guy named Bailey, and then immediately getting divorced, which is wild for a woman who was very much from a Catholic family, and it was like the 1920s, and that was like a big no-no, but Mildred Bailey would not be stopped. And she ended up moving down to Los Angeles and marrying a bootlegger. And so she was singing in the speakeasies of Los Angeles in the 1920s when her younger brother, Al Rinker, and his buddy, Bing, needed to get out of Spokane. They formed their own musical group. They needed to get out of Spokane, and would she help them? So she encouraged them to come to Los Angeles. They ended up getting hooked up with Paul Whiteman and his orchestra. So Paul Whiteman and the Rhythm Boys, Bing Crosby and Al Rinker. And so to repay the favor, they said, Mildred, you're going to cook dinner for the Paul Whiteman Orchestra. We're going to come over to your house. We're going to crash your house. Make dinner for us. So Mildred starts making dinner for Paul Whiteman and his orchestra, and Bing and Al. And Bing and Al were like, Mildred is an amazing vocalist. You need to hear her. You need to hear her. And Paul Whiteman looked at her because she was a larger woman and said, absolutely not. It doesn't matter how well she sings. I don't care. Look at her. Which, of course, yay, don't you love misogyny in the entertainment industry? That's gone now, right? So then Bing and Al are like, you know what? Okay, they're all eating. They're all really happy. Mildred was an amazing cook. They said, Millie, go sit down at the piano and play something. So she sits down at the piano and she starts playing. And the story goes that Paul Whiteman put down his fork, put down his plate, walked over, and she was hired immediately on the spot. And so she was the first woman to sing with an ensemble of that size. Now, a lot of history books said that she was white. The first time I went to a jazz history class at my undergrad, University of Miami, I was reading through, Ted Goya's history book, or, the history of jazz, evolution of jazz. And it said, Mildred Bailey, white vocalist. It's like, you're wrong, Ted. You're absolutely wrong. She was mixed, but she was native. So she was often credited as being white, but there was also sort of this debate amongst jazz musicians because she because of the way that she phrased like blues singers, but she had a high voice like the canary vocalists of Hollywood. So they're like, but she phrases like this, so she has to be black. But look at her skin, she has to be white. And lo and behold, she was indigenous. Mildred Bailey was one of the top vocalists in the US, in the world. There is a Billboard sort of, top vocalist ranking. In that Decca Recordings Billie Holiday's album that I loved as a kid, and it listed Mildred Bailey first, Ella Fitzgerald second, and Billie Holiday third, which I thought was wild for a Billie Holiday album of greatest hits. They would put that ranking in there, but she was the top vocalist of the time, and instrumentalists loved to play with her. She worked with Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey. She had one of the first integrated bands. She played at integrated clubs before that was ever allowed and ever fashionable in any way. But because she was difficult, she ended up disappearing from the jazz scene. And I thought it was really interesting reading the liner notes. I'm such a nerd. I'm sorry, guys. I'm such a nerd. I was reading the liner notes of one of Mildred's, there are like 10 CDs that came out of like all of her greatest hits. And the producer, John Hammond, wrote the liner notes, was one of the 3 people to write liner notes for it. And he said, Mildred and I didn't get along. We saw things differently. She wanted to record with big orchestras, but I preferred her with smaller ensembles. And because she's dead, and I'm in charge of this selection, I'm gonna choose her smaller ensemble stuff, because I think it's better. So here's this woman who knows what she wants, who wants to have some autonomy over her music and her artistry, and the men with money labeled her difficult because she didn't want to follow their rules. And Mildred Bailey died in 1951, broke in Poughkeepsie, New York, on a farm. Frank Sinatra, who didn't know her personally, ended up paying for some of her medical bills. Bing Crosby helped to pay some of her medical bills. But what he did after she died was he took control of a lot of her personal assets to pay himself back. When she died and was cremated, there were only 2 people who were there for her ceremony, her funeral. And that was her brother Al and her ex-husband Red Norvo. So Mildred and Red were known as Mr. and Mrs. Swing at the height of their time. So Mildred kind of disappeared into obscurity. Her obituary was buried on page 52 of the Spokesman Review, her hometown newspaper. In the 90s, she was inducted into the Big Band Hall of Fame, and there was a stamp that was released celebrating her contributions. But so often when I ask people, do you know who Mildred Bailey is? They're like, no, I don't. And that is wild to me. The first time I went to the Jazz Hall of Fame at Lincoln Center, I was so excited to be there because you get to see all of these beautiful, beautiful photographs of all of these amazing, prolific jazz musicians on the walls. But at that time, there were only 4 women. And Mildred Bailey wasn't one of them. And I thought, this is crazy that she was the first woman to sing in front of a big band. And you think about all of the women who came after her. You have Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, Dinah Washington. They got their start singing with big bands. And that was because everyone wanted to have that female vocalist in front of their ensembles because of what Mildred Bailey did. So if you have Wynton Marsalis's number, if you could just let him know, I've been looking for him for about 20 years to get her inducted into the Jazz Hall of Fame. So that's been my life's work. honoring and uplifting Mildred Bailey and her legacy. And what's cool is that by connecting with Delbert Anderson, then came about this idea of an Indigenous big band, because he'd played in big bands and I've sung in front of big bands, and I knew this long history of Indigenous people with their big bands on their tribal lands and stuff like that. And he was like, hey man, like if you ever do it, hire me. I was like, hey man, if you ever do it, hire me. Like it might never happen, but just let me know. And because of a grant opportunity during COVID, I got a phone call from Delbert. He was going to submit for the same grant, but for a different project. And he was like, Julia, I think you should write a behemoth of a grant making your case for an all-Indigenous big band and the legacy and the lineage and the importance of uplifting this music. And so I wrote a behemoth of a grant, pretty much outlining everything that I just did. And we were awarded full funding. And so we were able to put together an all-Indigenous big band in May of 2022 in Olympia, Washington. And it was so much fun, and it felt so good. All of these musicians coming together, having that shared experience of being Indigenous, even if they were First Nations or Alaska Native or Native Hawaiian or Taino from Cuba and from Puerto Rico. And, we had this shared experience of being Indigenous in America. And we had this common language of jazz. And being able to be up on a major stage with an all-Native, all-Indigenous ensemble was just really, really powerful. And so at the end of that gig, the guys, we all got together and we were like, cheers, 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 we did it. We're gonna do it again, right? That's not the end of this, right? And so now we've headlined the Mary Lou Williams Jazz Festival at Kennedy Center. We've performed at Birdland, and we'll be coming back to Berkeley, which I cannot wait. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to bring the big band here. I was telling Beth, did I tell you this? My mom is actually, this is her alma mater. My mom got her master's in public health here at UC Berkeley. So she says hello. And so to be able to bring this music, where my mom went to school and pursued her life's work, it's really, really special for me too. Anywho, I think that's all I have. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you also for talking about Mildred Bailey. I just need to make a small advertisement. I went to Stanford, and Julia's band is playing at Stanford tomorrow night. So if you can't wait till next year, you can get a sneak peek. So I just want to ask a couple questions and then open it up for a conversation. And one of the questions I think people tend to ask a lot is, where does music come from? And I think this is I've heard really interesting answers to this question, especially from Indigenous artists, where music comes from, because sometimes people will say that songs are medicine that's pulled down from the heavens, or some people will say that it comes from the earth. So when you think about where music comes from, how do you answer that question, or how do you think about it?
That is such an interesting question. I almost think it depends on the song. Mm-hmm. I think music comes from the heart, because when we think about, so one of the dangers of what it is that I do is sometimes people will say, oh, so you mean that jazz is Indigenous music? it comes from Native Americans, it comes from powwow music. And I say absolutely not. Jazz comes from the Black experience in America. Is there swing and syncopation in powwow music? Absolutely. So if you're a good ethnomusicologist, you look at the powwow music of the Americas, the tribal music of the Americas, and you look at the social and spiritual music of Africa. And there is syncopation in both. And there is swing in both. So how do we get that from like a scholarly standpoint? Where does that come from? That comes from the heart. I think the triplet, we're getting a little bit like deep into music theory now. I think the triplet subdivision, the 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, and 2, and 3, and there's your swinging eighth note, and 2, and 3, and 1, and 2, and da, ga, da, da, ga, da. That comes from the heart. So that triplet subdivision is native with a lowercase n. It is our human rhythm, our base human rhythm. And if you listen to the heartbeat, there are so many powwow songs and spiritual songs that have this in it. And we call it, oh, the drum is your heart, right? So where do songs come from? I think they come from the ancestors, they come from our descendants, and they come from that thing that ties us together, which is the heartbeat. I think that's probably where I would leave that.
That's really beautiful. I want to ask a question that relates to something. You gave this background about boarding schools and musical education through the boarding schools, but also you touched upon the ways that that Indigenous practices of music and dance were actually criminalized in the late 19th century, and that Native musicians would have their instruments confiscated, they would be imprisoned. There were a lot of consequences for playing Indigenous music. Mm-hmm. And so that's also part of this legacy that we have now. And one of the things about the boarding schools and the sort of suppression of culture was that Native students weren't allowed to express their culture or their music except for patriotic holidays. And so this gave them sort of a license. And so it feels a little full circle to me that now, like the Kennedy Center and other like government organizations monitoring the arts are asking for triumphalist narratives, are asking for patriotic performances. And I think that, once again, Native artists will come up with the merciless Indian savages jazz band or whatever it is.
In 3 parts.
That we've been through this kind of thing before. And so I guess just asking you, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience, to riff or reflect a little bit about how Native cultural traditions have had to sort of go under the radar, adapt, survive by taking on many different forms and by sort of moving with sort of shifting politics and policies, and how music and performance have been sort of sites of endurance.
Yeah. Well, and I think, again, any music history, you want to look at what's happening politically, socially, economically, and spiritually. And I think that also pertains to Indigenous music history and history of music in the Americas. Because you're absolutely right. There is this sort of like, we have to go underground, or, do we sort of sensationalize for the sake of preservation? Mildred Bailey was a Native jazz musician in a time when it was definitely not fashionable to be Native and it was not fashionable to be mixed Native. And she sang a song called Wigwamin'. And the number of times that journalists have tried to but she recorded Wigwamin'. And it's like, yeah, she did. It's also when you're not allowed to celebrate your culture, you celebrate where you can. And it's about survival, and it's about preservation of self and preservation of community. And that'll take on many different forms and iterations. So I think what we will see in this sort of time of, I don't know that people will go back underground. I do know by talking to folks in my band and folks in my community that there is that impulse to go back underground, because there's also part of what we're talking about is also accessibility to resources in order to be a musician, in order to practice. So yeah, folks are like, okay, I can't be a musician anymore. I can't practice my culture anymore because those resources are now gone, or venues will not hire me because of the list of forbidden words issued by the federal government. But I also think that because of this history of being penalized for who we are and having to adapt and having to be compliant, having to be malleable, I think we're also getting to a point with this next generation of Indigenous people who are very much returning to culture and language and traditional practices. There's also a little bit more defiance in what this new government and this new society and this new way of looking at us is, right? We don't want to mold around everybody's hard edges anymore. We're going to take up a little bit more space and have hard edges ourselves, and everybody else can kind of accommodate. Yeah, I don't know if that answered the question, but I definitely riffed.
Yeah, I do think that jazz is a little bit like storytelling, traditional storytelling in that way, where there's kind of a structure of a story, and then the storyteller can riff on things. So it makes a lot of sense.
Well, and I think that's also why, so many people are drawn to jazz because of that freedom within form, right? Mm-hmm. And jazz is a liberation music about self-expression, and so part of what I do, because my day job is working for my mom's company and working in American Indian and Alaska Native communities in substance abuse and suicide prevention and Indian boarding school training for tribal administrators, and working in that work, using jazz as a tool for folks to unearth and move through and release trauma. And so that ability to riff and to explore things, and maybe that note didn't really fit in there, and maybe that didn't work out. But the nice thing about music is that it's spoken and then it's gone, and so you're able to keep practicing. It's learning any language, right? But being able to use that language to express yourself and to release trauma and to uncover new stories. I think jazz is a really wonderful medium for communities that are faced with trauma.
I want to give our audience a chance to ask some questions. We have a few more minutes here together. Does anybody want to lead out? Okay. Mina, Mina, and then DeBarty.
Thank you so much. This is so insightful and enlightening. Thank you. My question, while you were giving the context and like telling us the history, I was thinking, what was going on in other musical genres, like classical music?
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear from you if you have any thoughts on
Oh, so within
deep. How were indigenous musicians accepted, not accepted? How did they evolve, educated into Western classical music in the same way? How is it different from jazz?
So there was a trumpeter from Navajo Nation named Jacob C. Morgan, and he. So this is probably this would definitely require more research on my part, but this is who I know of. There are like indigenous classical musicians, and Jacob C. Morgan is probably the best example of someone who went through the Indian boarding school experience, went into marching bands, and then went into playing with orchestras in Europe and bringing his band to Europe and having that type of career path. He ended up coming back to the Navajo reservation and becoming like a politician and like a tribal chairman within his tribe. But there's that on-ramp too to classical music by way of Indian boarding schools. So much of that music was either like military, and I spoke with a guy down in Arizona, and he said, yeah, like my dad was in Indian boarding school, and he came back and he had his band here, and then he went into the military and he was in the military band. And like, so there is that sort of common thread of going from one institution to the next and continuing with that music. You had someone who went in to do classical music,
Yeah,
correct?
my grandfather was in the military and became a conductor, and then he did a master's degree in classical composition. But Carlisle, like they had an orchestra that went and played at the Paris Expo in like 1918 or whenever that was, like in the early 20th century. And so the music, especially the marching bands, were going everywhere. The sports teams were going out. These were big. And then also there were classical musicians. And then you also were talking about, Mildred's mother, learned how to play the piano. And so, one of the Elizabeth Penny Wilson was also trained in classical music, but then she came home and transcribed traditional songs. So she could write the notation of traditional songs. And then one of the most prominent indigenous musicians in classical music right now is Jeremy Dutcher, who also was like an opera singer. Actually, I know a lot of Native people who like love opera. Like one of my friends from Fort Hall, he's like, yeah, I just drive across the reservation. So this like Big Sky, Idaho, like cranking up the opera. And I'm like, that is how you should listen to opera, right?
100%.
Is like out in the big, wide open Idaho, Montana. Like
Actually, Mike has Mike Hermany Horses, the guy whose dad was a pickup like jazz musician who would join Ellington's band when they came through. He has like a niece or a daughter who's an opera singer.
Is it emo? How many horses?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hermany Horses. Yeah. So opera's really big. And then, do you know Danielle? I'm blanking on her last name. But she's a classical conductor.
Well, also I was thinking of Brett Michael David. Is also a classical composer. So there, like right now, there are like Native people working in all of the genres, and just like with jazz, there are these threads going
This
down,
lineage,
back to the boarding schools. And it's kind of funny because I feel like the assimilation project was like, okay, we're going to take all these Native kids and we're going to turn them into like white Protestants. And it, like, totally not what happened. They came out and they're like, we want to play jazz. Like, what? Yeah, they did their own thing with the music that they received.
Yeah. I hope that answered your question. It's definitely. Have you heard Raven Chacon? Raven's great. I mean, Raven is more in the like experimental out. He won a Pulitzer Prize. It was so funny. So I was in conversations with Raven to compose. I commissioned a piece from Raven for the big band for our premiere. And then, like, right before the premiere of the band, he was like, hey, so I just won the Pulitzer. I'm going to be a little busy. I'll try to get you this composition. I was like, Raven, don't worry about it. You won the Pulitzer. Congratulations. That's really awesome. Whenever is fine. He ended up getting us his piece the night before the premiere. But the way that Raven composes, it's like pictures and symbols, and would take so much time just to like get my band to feel cool and okay with like something that is not traditional standard notation.
His scores could themselves be art pieces.
Yeah.
And it's,
Yeah.
I have to make another commercial because Raven gave a talk right in this very room. So if you want to go to our website and watch his presentation, he shows a lot of his work and plays some of it. Yes.
Raven is so cool. He's so cool. Anyways, definitely check out Raven too. There's that lineage as well.
Devarty, did you have a question too?
Sure. I don't know if I need this. It's not really a question. I guess I wanted to, it's an invitation. You sort of, you brought up this new climate of censorship that we have, the Kennedy Center, the drying up of grants, the outlawing of certain words. And what's so interesting in the history that you've given us is, I mean, jazz is well, it's music, it's not words. And I'm also sort of reflecting on your image of like how you've molded, how this tradition is sort of molded to other people's edges, and how what you're looking towards is a kind of reestablishment of certain edges. And I guess I wanted to ask you about how you feel as though, like, how do you think the work is going to continue in this climate? And what do you think you're going to be leaning into in terms of like various kinds of syncretism, various kinds of subversive experimental forms that, it's music. You can't really, maybe the lyrics are going to be different. Like, what's it looking like for you right now?
It's one of the things that I very much want to lean into. I mean, I feel like for so long we've been told self-care, right? Self-care, self-care. But now it's about community care. And especially with the big band, especially with this music, I want community care to be my primary focus. And so finding ways to work with the band, to work with the people who have reached out to be on like our list of subs, to build community and to continue with education for ourselves and peer sharing and peer learning amongst the band. So that's kind of like the higher level, like what will the focus be for the next 4 years is, we do have some amazing community partners who have said, in the summertime, our performance venue is empty and our dorm rooms are empty. And if you need a space, please come use our space. So for me, it'll be, okay, I'll have to source funding to get people people's flights. But that is so much more doable than like having to fund the entire, like an entire conference or jazz camp or whatever it would shape up to be. But so we do have some amazing community partners who are willing to work with us in that way. In terms of artistic expression, sometimes the greatest writing assignment is putting yourself in a box and having those limitations. So how do I write a grant for an Indigenous big band that doesn't include diversity, that doesn't include equity, that doesn't include inclusion, that doesn't include the word woman or female? It'll be tricky, but I know I can do it. And I think in terms of compositions, now is the time to really lean into that prophetic calling of disturbing the comfortable and comforting the disturbed. What Molly does with some of her pieces, one of my favorite compositions of hers that we get to perform is called Wawasin Tonda, and it was a Jesuit hymn that was translated into Abenaki in order to indoctrinate the Abenaki tribe into Christianity. And so what she explores with this traditional Christian hymn is the sort of insidious nature of indoctrination sonically. And so while we're not saying specifically indoctrination, genocide, destruction of culture, etc., we're saying it sonically. And I think that is the direction that we as artists have to go into. We can let our art speak for itself and be the indignant defiance act of protest. So while we do have a very strict and stringent box that we have to maneuver in, we've done it before, and so we can do it again. I hope that answered your question. Okay.
Joyful defiance is
Yes. Defiance with a smile. We're going to do it. Watch us do it. We'll see you in 4 years. Yeah. That's beautiful. Thank you. Any other questions, comments, concerns, complaints? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about how you learned music first. I'm interested in whether you learned Indigenous music first and then jazz, and then when it was separated and then when it came together. I'm interested in whether you first saw it, or whether you first heard things and you only heard Indigenous music, and then maybe, you had music that came to you in that way, and then when it comes together, whatever that sort of story is.
Yeah. So I actually, growing up on our tribe's reservation, I went to church every Sunday. And so that's actually where I learned music, was in the church, which is wild. But because we have such a tight-knit, tribal community, we also had powwows and celebrations, every spring, summer, and fall. And so being able to go and listen to powwow music, that was a huge part of my upbringing too. But I think I learned Protestant hymns in my Nez Perce language before I learned jazz, before I learned powwow music, before I learned anything else. So So that's one of the funny things about what the Jesuits did, right? It's like, while it was an indoctrination tool, it was also a language preservation tool. So thank you, Father Cataldo. So when did those two languages or identities come together, right? For a really, really long time, like I got into jazz, I got into jazz as a 4-year-old, but I didn't start singing jazz until I was maybe like 12 or 13. And I loved it. I thought it was the best. And but when I started performing professionally as like a 14-year-old, and I would introduce myself as a Native American jazz singer, oftentimes people would come up to me after my performance and say, "What do you mean by that?" Because what comes to mind for a Native American musician is not a scrawny kid up on stage singing a dirty old swing tune, right? So the fact that this mental image of a Native American musician and a jazz musician couldn't, like, these two things cannot coexist, what? People would get kind of frustrated and almost offended by me introducing myself in that way. And so for a very long time, I was malleable. And I didn't introduce myself as a Native American jazz musician, jazz singer, unless I was talking about Mildred Bailey. Like, having that historical context. I mean, first of all, it was awesome to stumble across her name, because then it was like, oh my God, I see myself represented in this music. But it also, by talking about her, it allowed me to exist in my full self, right? But sonically, those two identities remained separate until I met Delbert. And I met Delbert in 2021. So being able to see the incorporation of your traditional melodies or traditional language, being able to see that incorporated into jazz outside of a history book or outside of Pepper's powwow. It was really cool, and it was a liberating experience for me, because, yeah, for the longest time, they were very, very, very much divorced of each other. So it's a very recent phenomenon, and I'm still exploring it. And it was really cool when we played the Kennedy Center. We did a song from our tribe that's a prayer song that comes from my great grandmother, and I got to sing in my traditional language, and that was like really hip. I was like, oh my God, like, here we are, nation's capital, singing in Nimiputimpt. And my mom, she told me the night before that performance that the first person from our family to go to Washington, D.C. was my great-grandmother. And she was a student at Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. And what Indian boarding schools would do, was they would farm out their students to wealthy families in affluent neighborhoods. And so my great-grandmother, Lizzie Hayes Moody, was a housekeeper and a cook for affluent families in Washington, D.C. She was forbidden from speaking her language or acknowledging her indigeneity. And then, a few generations later, I got to be up on the Kennedy Center stage singing in that language. It was it's a big healing practice to explore all of this together. Thank you for that question. That was good. I almost started crying, but it was great. Yeah, thank you for that.
That might be the most beautiful place we could possibly end. So I do think we've had such a beautiful conversation with you today, Julia Katsiaoya. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. Yohkalo, that's all.
Thank you so much. Katsiaoya, everyone.